Cuba's next, by the way, but pretend I didn't say that, please. Pretend I didn't say that. Please, please, please.
Is Cuba next?
Well, it depends on what your definition of military action is.
Look, Cuba is calling us. They need help. I am very prone toward the Cuban Americans. They have family members in Cuba. They've been treated very, very badly. They've been treated extremely badly, and we're going to get that solved. That's not going to be hard for us to solve.
Cuba's in a lot of trouble because, unfortunately, for them, it's run by a bunch of incompetent communists. And being communist is bad. Being an incompetent communist is like the worst. So we'll be talking to them. We'll be working on it. You know, we want something good for the Cuban people, and hopefully there'll be a good outcome there for them. There needs to be. It's 90 miles from our shores, and having a failed state 90 miles from our shores is a threat to the national security of the United States.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday, and before that, President Trump, from over the past few weeks, both previewing the potential for U.S. intervention in Cuba. Those comments come as new reports from Axios reveal the White House is preparing for the possible collapse of Cuba's regime as early as this summer. Joining us now, the author of that piece, White House reporter from Axios, Mark Caputo. So, Mark, do we have a sense of, I mean, this seems to be gaining on us in terms of timing of when they might make a move?
Yeah, there's an amount of pressure that's being applied that no one's ever seen before from the United States toward Cuba. And recently, last month, the SOUTHCOM, Southern Command, that oversees military operations in the Caribbean, held what's called a joint agency or interagency task force or tabletop exercise, where they wargamed out different scenarios. And in those discussions, they talked about, among other things, two things, one of which we'd reported before, the potential drone threat from Cuba, as Cuba has acquired drones, and the possibility of an incident and problem occurring in the summer. Understand that the United States has essentially taken over trade toward Cuba. It has restricted fuel, or oil does not come into Cuba anymore, in part because Cuba has no money. And therefore, there's barely any electricity. People can't keep cool. They can't keep food cool. There's no refrigeration. And in South Florida, and then south of me here in Miami, in Havana, in June, it starts to get really hot. In July, it starts to get really hot. And in July 11th of 2022, there were massive protests in the heat against the regime because people felt that it wasn't meeting their needs. The economy was in collapse. It was post-COVID as well. And the regime brutally repressed the protesters, the demonstrators, and jailed a lot of people. This time, some of these exercises that the U.S. military has begun to examine is what would happen if the U.S. intervened in the case that the president decided to go in and protect people who are being repressed from the regime. And that's where the possibility, again, it's the possibility, not the probability, of U.S. military intervention starts to really come to the fore, and is something that they've examined.
So, Mark, with the indictment of Castro last week, a lot of people saw a pattern that we saw in Venezuela. Yep. Indict Maduro, get him out, for past crimes, get him out of the country, install new leadership. America controls the new leadership. But you say in the piece that Cuba, despite this indictment of Castro, is a little bit of a different story. How are they different?
There's three major differences between Cuba and Venezuela. To begin with, in Venezuela, when the operation was beginning in the summer of 2025, the Trump administration, its advisors, started to cultivate, for lack of a better term, Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president for Maduro at the time, who's now the leader of Venezuela, and start to kind of figure out, okay, who would take over if Maduro were removed, and removed either that he left or that he was killed or that he was snatched. Obviously, he wound up being snatched on January 3rd. And what would that look like? Because it was sort of a vertical power structure where they could do that. And they had a competent person who was able to run it. Here, the United States can't really find that in Cuba. And that brings us to sort of point two. Outside of there being no Delcy, they haven't really identified a Delcy yet, or, as one of the advisors said, Delcy lights, or people who are Delcy-ish. You have the fact that Cuba's power structure is just different. It doesn't have that vertical structure. And so if you remove Raul Castro, who's 94, it's not really going to do much. And that sets aside the fact that getting him is going to be complicated. And then the third factor is Cuba has and is subject to a U.S. embargo that was codified into U.S. law in 1996. Venezuela didn't have that. It had sanctions that were imposed by the executive branch. So any changes in governance that happen in Cuba and any attempt to lift sanctions or the embargo can't really happen unless Congress signs off on it or three very specific rules or benchmarks are met. They have to free political prisoners, they have to have free elections, and they have to guarantee other civil rights. It's a much more complicated nut to crack in Cuba than in Venezuela.